unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. This week, climate negotiators and world leaders from around 200 countries are descending on the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el Sheikh for COP27, the 27th gathering of the 197 nations that signed up to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1992. As the proceedings get underway, a huge question mark hangs over this year's climate summit. Rich nations are pushing for poor countries to announce greater cuts to carbon emissions, but developing countries claim their developed counterparts have stiffed them when it comes to climate finance. To make sense of the dynamics at this year's gathering and to explore the unique role that India plays, I'm joined on the show today by Bill Spindle. Bill is the climate and energy editor at the new journalism startup Semafor. He's also a 10-year veteran of the Wall Street Journal, where he served as the South Asia bureau chief from 2016 to 2020. Most importantly, in my view, Bill has spent the last year crisscrossing the length and breadth of India, traveling 8,000 kilometers by train, reporting on the transformation of India's energy sector. I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Bill, good to talk to you.
Thanks, Milan. I'm a big fan. I'm really thrilled to be here.
So I want to take us back to the last COP, COP26 in Glasgow. 200 countries agreed to revisit and strengthen their emissions targets by the end of 2022 in order to really align them with this overall goal of limiting global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the agreement, as you know better than most, noted that many rich countries, while demanding poor countries reduce emissions, have not exactly held up their part of the bargain by providing adequate financing. So before we talk about what's going to happen in Egypt, what's your assessment of how well countries have stuck to the agreement that they made in Glasgow last year?
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like that, what was that, a year ago? And it feels like a totally different world we were in back then. We had, the sort of, we were coming out of COVID then, the energy crisis was starting to really take hold. Energy prices were going up, food prices were starting to go up, but the Ukraine war just changed, the whole landscape, both, obviously in Europe, but globally for energy transition, and really for this COP as well. So you've got, the big players coming in really in totally different places. Europe is coming in real turmoil. It's goals still in place for energy transition, but making a lot of scrambling around and compromises, frankly, on some of that, at least in the short term. You've got the U.S. coming in, on the other hand, was looking pretty weak when John Kerry showed up last year, because they really didn't have much to show during the Trump administration, which was really what they were still operating on, right? They were really not doing much at all. And now they passed this Inflation Reduction Act, the Build Back Better bill. Those things have really given the U.S. a stronger hand coming in. And then the last thing that's changed immensely is we've gone through yet another summer, really even more acutely, where the developing world in particular has really suffered through a lot of climate disruption. Pakistan flooding, that was just an absolutely catastrophic situation there. Africa's seen a lot of both flooding and droughts. So there's really an acute awareness now that climate change is really, not just kind of upon us, but gaining steam, gaining momentum, and really shaping the perceptions of people coming into this. So it's a really different climate coming in, to use the phrase.
So when you think about this idea, there's this threshold of keeping the temperature rise to at or below 1.5 degrees of Celsius. And that's really the threshold beyond which climate scientists believe we could see catastrophic impacts, right? Assuming kind of steady state status quo, where are we at? Are we on track as a world community to meet that target?
Yeah, that's the other thing that's kind of changed since then. At the end of the Glasgow COP, there was really a last grasping reach to try to say we can accomplish the 1.5 degree kind of ambitious goal set back in Paris. Well, even the UN has come out in the last month or two with the UN Environmental Program with its kind of assessment saying 1.5 degrees is really, there's no credible path to even reaching that. And that really now if everyone does what they're supposed to have done under Paris, which is not only what they've already promised to do, but ratcheting up those promises, coming through on the conditional things that can make other things happen. Even with that, we could only really reach credibly 1.8 degrees. So, again, that's changed. Things have, clearly we're falling further behind, and that's going to make this COP a very rough COP, I think.
So you've talked about kind of changing geopolitics. You've talked about the fact that we haven't exactly kept up to our promises. So as countries are getting ready for this year's COP, again, it'll take place in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. You have written in your newsletter, and we'll link to this, and I want to quote here, without some deft diplomacy and the prospect of real money flowing to the developing world, a train wreck could result at COP27. Is there a consensus on what the objectives are of this year's gathering?
No, there really isn't yet. And this this potential train wreck could happen as the train is literally emerging from the station on its way at the beginning. Yes, the Sunday, the official COP officially kicks off, and the first big real point of confrontation and contention is going to be over what's going to be on the actual agenda. Developing world countries are really insistent on putting what they term loss and damage, which is we need to be compensated for the damage that we are now suffering and the losses we're now suffering from climate damage that was caused by the developing world over the last 100-some years. And that's kind of where the last COP ended, with the developed countries essentially refusing to really put that on the agenda in any way whatsoever. And that's what this COP is going to start with. So that's what will be taken up Sunday. So it could go off the rails right from the beginning. I'm guessing it won't. I think it will become an agenda item, but the most contentious thing could happen right at the beginning.
So maybe this is a good time to kind of ask you a little bit about the what you expect on the ground, right? We know, for instance, the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has said she's going to skip COP27 entirely. She's criticized the global summit as a forum for quote unquote greenwashing. There have been many others, particularly, in the NGO space, that have expressed outrage about the lack of space for civil society at this year's meeting. Tell us a bit about the atmospherics you expect on the ground. And, does the identity of the host, Egypt, really matter?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion and debate and controversy over those very issues. I think, coming off of Glasgow, which was even by COP standards, a tremendous circus of companies and activists and organizations all trying to do their own messages and often conflicting. Egypt is going to be a much more controlled affair. Egypt is a much more controlled country with a pretty controversial record on human rights and on dealing with NGOs, activist groups. I think they made some efforts to bring some of them in, but it's just not going to be the sort of democratic free-for-all that we saw in Glasgow and where we've seen in the past. What that means for the actual outcome is a little hard to say, but it's the flavor of it, the kind of atmosphere around it is almost certainly going to be quite a bit different, more subdued, perhaps is the way to put it.
In a recent note, you noted that of the many question marks hanging over this year's summit, one of the biggest is the U.S.-China dynamic, right? You've noted that there's been a real lack of coordination between the U.S. and China, which are the two biggest contributors to global warming. As we come upon the summit, how much do U.S.-China relations cast a shadow on this kind of global set of negotiations?
Yeah, I'm not so much sure it's a shadow. It's just a lack of potential there. Although, perhaps now that Xi Jinping has got his third term and we're through that, perhaps they are the biggest wild card. Maybe there could be some sort of deal, or at least a parallel movement on the part of the two biggest and most important countries, the U.S. and China, in this field that could really change the complexion of what happens here. They've made a huge difference in the past. Obama cut a deal with China going months before the COP that really gave it momentum coming in. There have been other deals in the past. That was before Paris. There's been other deals in the past. John Kerry has been a part of those. So potentially something could happen there. But when I talked to John Kerry maybe a month ago, there hadn't been any discussion. He didn't expect there was going to be any discussion. And it was just, we're going to both show up there and hopefully something will happen, most likely independently and in parallel rather than negotiated, because China specifically said after the whole hullabaloo over Nancy Pelosi's visit that climate negotiations were being suspended, along with so many other things.
So just kind of thinking about the key players more generally, at past climate summits, a lot of our attention, a lot of the media attention has been oriented towards the United States, the EU, China, India. Are these still the principal actors to watch, or are there other kind of dark horses, regional blocks, particular countries that are going to be kind of worth watching out?
Yeah, I think this will be, as they've said often and seems to be right, this will be the Africa COP. Egypt is in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is really the epitome of regions that contributed virtually nothing whatsoever to the climate problem and yet are suffering the most damages, and they're the most vulnerable countries, and they have the least resources to deal with it. So that will define this COP, really, the whole question of whither the developing world and what is the developed world going to do about that. So that's probably the biggest other place to watch in terms of what defines it. I do think we're going to see a little different perspective on fossil fuel companies and oil companies as we go through this COP and in fact the next one as well, which will be next year in Abu Dhabi. In Glasgow, they were all but banished and pilloried and told they had no role to play. They're back really now saying we do have a role to play. Abu Dhabi and Saudi are very close to Egypt, and so that argument's going to get an airing at this COP, but especially going into the next COP is what is the role of broadly fossil fuels in the energy transition, if they have one, and what is the role of petrostates in that?
And do you get the sense, Bill, from kind of watching these things play out, that the petrostates are at a position where they can really flex their muscles? Because, oil prices are high. We're talking about a very dark, potentially very cold winter in Europe. Everyone is stressed out in the United States heading into a midterm election about energy prices, about gas prices, about inflation. And so do you feel like this set of countries has a kind of new wind at their backs?
I think they do, in the sense that it's awfully hard to delegitimize them, as happened at the last COP, when Europe itself is turning back to coal to a certain extent, when President Biden is openly courting and trying to get the oil industry in his country to produce more oil, and visiting Saudi Arabia to get them to produce more oil. So in that environment, that it's going to be very hard to delegitimize fossil fuels. So in that sense, they have some wind at their back, and I also think they feel they have some role. And could have some role. Particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are vastly wealthy countries. They have their own quite ambitious plans with renewable energies, and are making big investments in both renewables, hydrogen, solar, also carbon capture, to the extent they can get that to work. So I think they feel like they play a role in this. And as they continuously point out, the world is not done with oil and gas, maybe even coal, but particularly oil and gas. And if somebody's going to produce, if you need oil and gas, well, we're the countries that produce it with the least emissions at the lowest cost. So shouldn't we play a role in that sort of transition? I think that argument's going to get an airing.
So this is obviously a podcast about India, so I want to spend some time asking you about India's role in all of this. You, of course, spent many years covering India for the Wall Street Journal, but then you spent a full year after that traveling across the country, basically, reporting on the energy transition and on the impacts of climate change and so on. Let me just start at a kind of macro level. Many Indians I've spoken to, particularly people in government, politicians, feel like the country hasn't really received the acknowledgement it deserves for helping to stitch together a global consensus on climate change, right? For a long time, India was seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Do you think India is right to have a bit of a chip on its shoulder, to sort of feel this underappreciated?
In a sense, yes. And I think, as I went around, as I lived in India for a full 4 years and did a lot of traveling then, but especially over the earlier part of this year as I went, around the entire circumference of India, visiting all sorts of different places. This is really a country that is typifies. It is in the throes of experiencing climate change impacts and damage on the one hand, and yet it is also very much in the throes of a quite amazing an aggressive move into renewable energy. India is making huge progress in that, and they really are making an impact both in their own country and globally in terms of sort of the energy transition and renewable energy. They've got a lot of coal issues, obviously, still to deal with. But I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind, and it gets to India's really important role in this COP, is for many, many years prior to Paris, which was 2015, this critical Paris Accord that really kind of reshaped the way these negotiations take place in global climate diplomacy, India really had been seen as pretty intransigent, as pretty rejectionist. Often how it's perceived in trade negotiations was kind of the approach. In Paris, very early in Prime Minister Modi's term, he really changed that a bit. And as my understanding was, it came right from the top that India really was seen as playing an important role undergirding the Paris both agreement and the impetus behind it, which was, we're all going to try. This is the Paris dynamic, right? We're all going to pull together. We're all going to do as much as we can, via our own means and our own abilities to get this going. And, the developing world will be a part of that. They do have differentiated, as they call common and differentiated responsibilities, but that everybody's going to pull together on this. And he really was part of what changed the character and outcome at Paris. And that, was very important for India because they really, I think the Modi administration has been really keen on appearing to be kind of global diplomats and players on the global stage, and climate has been one area they could do that. That puts them in a very interesting position going into this COP with this real divide between developed and developing countries that's really become quite bitter. And, China has always played the role of defending the developing world, but it's not going to be able to do that very easily anymore because it's really barely a developing country on any level, and it is by far the world's largest emitter of fossil fuel global warming gases. So it can't really play the role of developing. It's firmly in that camp. That, I think, does open the door for India to figure out where it's going to play this. I think India's also far ahead in the development chain or the development ladder from sub-Saharan African countries, certainly, but still feels a lot of that same frustration with the developed world and some of the hypocrisy that's come out of the developed world and the inability or the unwillingness to provide funding. So it will certainly be going and has been going very vigorously to bat for the African nations, for the developing countries. And yet India itself could play a larger role in sort of forging some sort of a solution through this so that we don't see a complete train wreck, because it is very much a part of it's heading the G20 this year. It's very sees it and wants to see itself as part of the global leadership, and so I think India could play a role in trying to help both sides find a way through this that doesn't lead to a complete disaster.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, in addition to the new newsletter, Bill, that you do at Semafor, you've also had this really amazing Substack, which, where you've chronicled your travels across the length and breadth of India, and we'll link to that in the notes. One of your dispatches talked about renewable energy, and what I found so interesting is, you noted that India has expanded renewable energy faster than any other large country in the past decade. And one statistic that really boggled the mind is that, solar power capacity alone has grown 60-fold, 60, in just a decade. Tell us a little bit about, what's driving this really aggressive push into renewable energy.
Yeah, I think in short, it is economics. And I think that's what India can to some extent shape this debate coming out of the developing world, is that increasingly India is finding that there is a false choice it really wasn't a false choice really before, say, 2015 or something like that. It cost more there was like a green premium you had to put on it. But in India and many other places, including in many places in sub-Saharan Africa, there is not a green premium. There's a green benefit. It really is cheaper to put in renewable energy. Now, that doesn't mean you can instantly replace the whole grid or get rid of coal right off the bat, because there are problems with the variability of renewable energy. The wind is not always blowing, the sun's not always shining. It's hard to deliver, and India's almost always operating right at the very cusp of its ability to provide energy. So, it's not all of the solution, but economically, it's really inarguable that is the future of India's power and energy system. Is going to be built on things like renewables, hydrogen, where India's got a very ambitious plan for. So it's interesting to see both sides of that, and they're kind of they're experiencing the problem and running forward really quite spiritedly with the solution as well.
So, back in June, you were in the northeastern state of Manipur, and you wrote about the incredible impact that even imperfect, intermittent electricity can have on the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people. And our listeners will know that the Modi government has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of acclaim for its claim of achieving universal electrification. I guess my question to you is, how much credit do they deserve? And what challenges does India still face in terms of connecting every last household to the grid?
Yeah, I think they deserve significant credit. I mean, the country, just in the 5 years that I was there from 2016 on, or maybe count back a few years from that, they've really, brought hundreds of millions of Indians energy and electricity. They've done it in a very Modi-like way, in that it's been done with sort of big, well-publicized projects based very much on very close counting and lots of advertisement of keeping track of numbers. It's very similar to the Swachh Bharat type program. And similarly, when you go out, as I did, into some of these areas, I went to the last village that was theoretically the very last village in India to be electrified. We've accomplished the whole thing. They had been out of electricity for almost 2 days, and they didn't know when it was going to come back on. It did not come back on by the time I left. So, those are the kind of challenges that any country is going to run into as it starts to bring this. It's never quite as good as advertised, but nonetheless, they do have electricity there a large percentage of the time. It is changing people's lives. And I think the next step is going to be really India looking to get beyond just the sort of completely grid-based model. There's a lot of very interesting work being done in off-grid microgrids and ways to get energy access really out to really regular, reliable energy access, and clean energy access out to a lot of areas that still don't have regular access to it in any meaningful way.
So, India, I think, to put it bluntly, has long been known for its chaotic power generation and distribution channels. Politicians want to win the votes of consumers. The discoms are under enormous pressure to underprice power. Profitability suffers, debts pile up. You took a reporting trip to Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state, and I was struck, Bill, by the kind of note of optimism that you struck in that note, where you said, well, maybe things could be changing somewhat due to renewables. And I just want to quote what you said there. Cheaper renewable energy creates the funds to improve services and billing, which produces more revenues, allowing still more investments in renewable energy that save more money. Now, that sounds like a win-win-win. What's the catch?
That's the virtual circle, right? That we all hope to see and many Indians want to see, and that makes sense. The problem is the DISCOM problem, which DISCOMs are the electric utilities, as we call them in most other parts of the world. They are a tremendous political economy mire of different vested interests, and in many ways, all of the problems and challenges that the Indian state and the Indian system has come together in the DISCOMs, and so that remains a huge problem. I don't think there's any remotely comprehensive solution anywhere near the horizon. But you have seen some places. Gujarat has made significant progress improving its DISCOM performance. And even in Uttar Pradesh, which is frankly one of the messiest, most difficult and problematic places for electricity and power, and one of the places, by no coincidence, that has the least amount of renewable energy installed and can use it, has tons of resources. Even there are some signs, and I did visit, or at least became aware of a project where an NGO there was working quite closely with one of the DISCOMs there to try to improve their billing performance to get people to pay. And they were making some progress. But interestingly, they wouldn't let me visit the project. They didn't want to talk about it, partly because it's really the third rail of Indian politics, getting involved in that, in really fundamentally changing how those DISCOMs work. Really means changing the fundamental underlying politics. And as you well know, the money involved with all of that is vast in a place like the UP. So some progress, not I wouldn't get overly hopeful. I work hard to try to be optimistic and point to points of optimism.
So,
which is why that was there.
I want to ask you about something that you wrote in June, where, again, just striking a bit of an optimistic note, you said, unlike a lot of countries we could point to, India is well on track to not just meet, but surpass the voluntary commitments it made in Paris several years ago. But you also pointed out that Indians are going to have to take on more than the rest of the world, unfair though that may be. So, we know what the stakes are for the planet. I think that's been well documented. What are the stakes for India specifically if climate change, the kind of volatile weather patterns that we're seeing, if those continue unchecked?
Yeah. I think India is, as the Modi administration always loves to say, we have met and exceeded our promises. Now, that's partly because their promises were pretty modest. However, I think it's not. India has a pattern and a past of coming through in the long term, and that's really what matters in this case. Is really not. It's not. In the developed world, they need to begin reducing their emissions immediately, and they have the ability to do it. In India, the real trick is not so much what happens today, tomorrow, next week, beyond next year, as much as what happens after 2030, as more and more Indians get connected up to the power system, as their energy use begins reaching, even the norms of, say, China, which is half of what's, used in the U.S. They could, if they're still addicted to coal and have 2/3 of the energy of the electricity system, at least, coming from coal, we're going to see an explosion of emissions. And that's a huge problem, first and foremost for Indians, because they're among the countries that are most vulnerable. So I think over time, as frustrated as Indians can become with the West and how it's not stepping up in ways that they think it should, really the bottom line for India is put that aside, and it may be unfair in the sense that it's unjust that they should have to do this without the the culprits who caused the problem contributing more, put that aside and realize that for the benefit and the self-interest of Indians, it makes every bit of sense to move forward with this. And they know this quite well. Nobody more than the Modi administration would like to get out from under $100 billion plus in oil imports every year. Nobody would like to reduce energy costs, which renewables definitely do at this point more than the powers that be in India. And that's why you're seeing really a pretty strong rallying around renewable energy, even amongst the big traditional, fossil fuel industry leaders like Reliance Industries and Adani. They're moving really quite forcefully into renewable energy. Now they're keeping up their other lines of businesses too, but they certainly see profits to be made and big businesses to be built, and that's what they're doing because it's in the interest of India.
So, let me just ask you one more thing specifically about India before we wrap up, Bill, which is, Prime Minister Modi made somewhat of a big splash at the last COP by pledging a net zero emissions commitment by 2070. Now, that missed a key goal of the COP26 summit because the goal really was to get all nations to commit to a net zero pledge by 2050. But nevertheless, there was a big lobbying effort outside and within India, frankly, to get Modi to do this, and he did. How much of a game changer, is this? Is it, how excited should we be about this commitment, and what do we know about how they plan on achieving it?
Yeah, I think like all net zero commitments, a net zero 2070 commitment is an awfully long way out there, awfully easy to make for a prime minister in the age of...
Particularly when you're not going to be in power then, right?
Or perhaps even alive, right? But so in that sense, I think it made a big deal. It was a big difference, big deal, and again, played that leadership role within the Glasgow conference, which was kind of the net zero conference. But all that's kind of gone out the window since then. We're in a different world for all the reasons we talked about before, but also because the important thing that people have really started to realize is not what happens in 2050 to 2070, for gosh sakes. It's what happens between now and 2030 and from 2030 to 2035 and in the shorter term. And that's the critical stuff for India. And India has so many incentives to do things, particularly expand the renewable energy stuff for its own reasons, for its own incentives. And if that's what happens, then India will make a huge contribution, both for its own interests and a global contribution. That still the tricky, tough nut for India is, at the end of the day, this coal issue. So even the game plan basically is we're going to grow the energy system dramatically, and all of that growth is going to be filled by renewable energies. Well, that still leaves a whole lot of coal production on an absolute basis, if not a relative basis, and that's going to be a tricky situation for India. But the optimist in me says that over time they may not want to talk about rolling back coal now. They certainly don't want to make any promises to do it. But they may find it to be in their own interests. And I even met some people who had some concerns that the biggest concern for India in terms of a just transition, a fair transition, is that, in fact, the rollback of coal becomes an economic imperative and happens faster than people can prepare for. I visited, for example, an area like Talcher in Odisha. That's an area that's totally dependent on coal. It's a very poor area and similar to some of the rest of the areas in the world that have gotten the short end of the stick, but what they have comes from coal. And so those areas could really be profoundly affected if the transition moves along faster than people expect. And the optimist in me wants to think that will, but it needs to be prepared for and done in an organized way.
So, Bill, I want to kind of end this conversation by maybe asking you to come back to COP27. There's going to be a lot of high stakes negotiations, a lot of drama, a lot of audibles perhaps called at the last minute. But I'm going to ask you to kind of look into your crystal ball. What is the suite of possible scenarios coming out of this COP, and what do you think the likelihood of each of those is coming to fruition? If you could just kind of tell us, what are the range of outcomes we should be focused on?
Yes, well, it's very hard to predict such specifics. I will say, I think that in some ways, whatever happens, I feel like we're moving out of a kind of into a post-Paris Agreement world. Paris there was a real kumbaya moment back in 2015, which led to a lot of, we're all going to pull together on this and we're going to do the best we can, all of us, and that's going to get us there. There have always been some tensions, but I think the tensions are really coming to the surface now. Now, Paris accomplished a lot going forward in that it provided a pretty decent framework and a way to count emissions and make sure countries aren't double counting and measure progress. And that framework will continue on and was a great benefit. But I feel like we're moving into a world that's going to be much more defined by the actual impacts the world, the globe, everyone is feeling, but especially the developing world is feeling. And to the extent that the developed world is not able to step up in their own interests in many ways to provide even the money that they promised, a decade ago, it's going to be very, very messy. So I think, in terms of scenarios, I think on the one hand, you could imagine a complete train wreck that really leaves everyone kind of angry and frustrated and getting nowhere. A better scenario is one where there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of anger expressed, and not a whole lot of money specifically moved, but perhaps some framework, an acknowledgement that more money does move, some frameworks to bring it into fruition could come out of this, and that could get us through in a decently cooperative way, moving towards the next COP.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist Bill Spindle. Bill is the climate and energy editor at the new journalism startup Semafor, where he authors a regular newsletter on climate and energy issues. Bill, thank you so much for walking us through this minefield. Congratulations on the new gig and congratulations on the blog, which I hope our listeners will check out. And best of luck reporting on all the latest from Sharm el Sheikh.
Thanks, Milan. It's been really fun.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review to help others find the show. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Production assistance comes from Nithya Love. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.